So about a year ago, I started authoring my blog post using Markdown, which has been fantastic. However, I have years and years of blog content that was written in HTML and is stored as HTML in my database. So for example, here's a post 2787, and you can see it has paragraph tags. I have these complicated table layouts for including things like video iframes and other images. Let's see what else. There's my code formatting. So you can see here I have this div class code, and then inside the div class code is actually an unordered list, and I have all these LIs with different tab classes, and then of course all of the HTML within that is escaped, right? I have NBS, no break spaces, and I have various other HTML constructs that have been escaped inside that, and all kinds of just heavy markup. And what I'd love to do is be able to take 15 years of HTML content and store it as Markdown, or convert it to Markdown. And so ultimately what I did was I wrote a script over the weekend that will go through, parse all of this HTML, and then use a whole bunch of sort of recursive sanitization and transformation to output this HTML as Markdown. So ultimately what I end up with is this content here. All of the HTML for things like paragraph tags have been stripped out. My links are converted into Markdown links. Instead of those complicated table layouts, I have simple divs for my videos and my image frames, lists normally, and then my code blocks are now just normal fenced code blocks where all of the code has been unescaped, and so on and so forth. We jump over into the code here. You can see here's the Markdown, much better color coded. And so let me take a quick look at how this is done, because it took me all weekend to write. So essentially I'm going through the database and I'm looking for any entries where there is no Markdown content stored in the database. The HTML has been stored in either the content or the formatted content. The use of these different columns has changed over the years. So essentially what I do is I try to use the formatted content first, and then I fall back to the content, and then I'm passing off to this convert to Markdown. Now there's a lot of code here, so I'm only just going to quickly run through some of the basic steps. But essentially what we're going to be using is the htmlParse method that's native to Lucee CFML. That's going to parse the HTML into an XML document object model, and then I have a little helper method that then strips out all of the namespaces so that my subsequent XPath queries can run a lot more smoothly. Because the HTML content is parsed into XML, it means that we can use all of the normal XML traversal and searching methods, like XML children, for example. So the body node will contain all of the content of my posts, and then I'm going to convert those nodes to Markdown. Now the convert nodes to Markdown essentially becomes a recursive call. So for example, here you'll see that I'm mapping each node in that XML children's array, and I'm calling this convert node to Markdown. Now convert node to Markdown then looks at the particular element node, and you'll notice that I have explicit cases for every single thing that I'm looking for in the content. And if I see something that I didn't expect, I throw an error. I do this for elements, I do it for also class names. So for example, you can see here that I'm looking at a class name, and eventually I throw an error if I get an unexpected class name. And the idea was that I wanted this algorithm to be built iteratively, and I wanted it to break every time it hit something that it didn't expect. And that's because I needed to be able to look at the HTML as it was breaking to figure out how to best write transformations on that HTML to get it to Markdown. My approach to HTML has changed a lot over the years, and the way that I was doing formatting and color coding and so on and so forth, and each piece of this needed to have like special white glove treatment. Some of these are pretty simple, like if I hit an anchor tag, you can see here that I'm just converting to the simple anchor tag style. However, if I do something like I hit a div, that div has some special handling for some really old code formatting, so like a div that contained paragraph tags, which never has these days. And then I look at the different class name on the divs to see if it's a code or an hrule or SEO or stack trace, and then each one of these has its own separate method here So for example, if we look at the code version, you can see that I'm grabbing all of those ULs and LIs, right? If we jump back here into the code, right, all of these LIs within my div tab, my div codes, I need to transform those into unescaped code content, and then I have to convert that into this special format with the data gist, and I have to create code content. I have to fence it, so I have to parse the code content to get the appropriate fencing so I don't accidentally escape outside of the code fencing by having code that has code fencing within it. So for example, right, so if we jump down here, you'll see that I'm looking for the backtick. I'm sorting the backticks based on length. If there are no backticks or the longest one is less than 3, then I use the 3. Otherwise, I take the longest set of backticks and then I just double it for ease of use, right? And so there's all kinds of stuff like this buried in this algorithm. Let's see what is anything else here interesting. Right, so for titles, I take the text and I have to repeat for the title heading, which is essentially the number on the right side of that XML name, so we can get the number of pound signs repeated properly. Some of these are super simple, italics. I do run into some interesting use cases where I have nested lists and things like inserting a comment after each list to make sure the two lists next to each other don't run into each other. Anyway, so on and so forth. Again, there's like all this kinds of like janky old code formatting stuff that I had to then convert into kind of this modern markdown approach. And it was really a pain in the butt. And it's not perfect, right? It gets me like 90% of the way there, maybe 98% of the way there. The idea is that once I get this markdown into the database, then if I have to go back and edit an old post, all I have to do is kind of give it the once over, fix any markdown errors, and then republish it. And this just gets me one step closer to having a completely markdown driven blogging platform, which is super exciting.